Hello and welcome to another live episode of On Air with Lachie. I'm your host, Lachie Harris. Tonight's topic is another controversial issue, and that is the asylum seeker debate in Australia. You'll be hearing from Professor Mary Crook, a professor in public law, discussing her views on the issue, Professor Jane Adams discussing myths associated with asylum seekers, and finally you'll hear from Najiba Wazifadost, an Afghan Hazara refugee, and her story about coming to Australia. As I mentioned before, Professor Mary Crook is a professor of public law at the University of Sydney. She's also an accredited expert in immigration law. For the past 2 decades or so, Australia has had an increasingly harsh view of asylum seekers. Anyone who comes to Australia by boat, and it needs to be stressed there ain't a great deal who make it such a long journey down here, aren't given the greatest reception. Now, a couple of years ago, the then Prime Minister Kevin Rudd and his government struck a deal with Papua New Guinea, which said that they'll give their boat people to Papua New Guinea with a lot of money. It was a surprisingly right-wing kind of response, and it left the Conservative Party, the coalition, kind of scratching their heads as to how they could go further right than the Labor Party just did. Mary, what do you make of all of this?
My reaction to that was to say, well, it's a device for the election and it's not going to happen. Everybody knows that the capacity of PNG to take these people is inherently very limited, and I just don't think it will happen.
Though, is it something that we can legally do?
Of course we can. I mean, in practical terms, I'd put my house on that never really happening in practice.
Isn't this the sort of idea that the current government, which is the Abbott government, are quite attracted to as a solution for refugees?
Look, if you recall back in 2001, John Howard stated then that everybody who was sent to Papua New Guinea and to Nauru would never set foot in Australia, that they would not be allowed to come here, they would be resettled elsewhere. Everybody knows that that's not what happened. Yes, there were some people who were returned to their country of origin. Yes, a small number of people were resettled in the Scandinavian countries, but the vast majority of asylum seekers who were sent to those countries ended up in Australia.
So why do you think that the objectives weren't met there then?
Nauru is a tiny little speck in the middle of the ocean. It doesn't have the capacity to keep people. It's clear that asylum seekers will have to be shifted from there. The whole world sees this as Australia's problem. Why are they going to take these people? Papua New Guinea at the moment is a failed state. I agree with you. I think the announcement by a putatively progressive government that they were going to send our refugees permanently to a failed state just begged belief. It does beg a belief. I don't believe also, however, that they would be able to do that in the longer term, and I do believe that the PNG people have started to back off that already.
Mary, can you just tell me and the listeners a little bit about Australia's boat people problem in quotation figures compared to maybe other countries? I mean, I know some of the figures from Europe, for example, that kind of show that it's a much bigger problem over there compared to the reaction here in Australia.
Yeah, of course. Look, the truth is that we are an island people here. We are used to immigration control, and it's always been very difficult to get to Australia. So historically and in our deep culture, we don't respond very well to irregular migration, but we respond very badly to people who have come by boat. That, of course, is hugely ironic because we, if you go back far enough, came by boat. Of course, the Indigenous people learnt at their cost how dangerous people coming by boat are.
Do you think we're proud of the fact that we came by boat?
We are, yes. But I think ultimately as island people, we are afraid of people coming by boat equally. Our politicians have been able to play to that fear very effectively. Now, in some respects, we're no different from any other society. Any society is inherently bounded, and if you characterise strangers coming in as threats of some kind, it's very easy to get fear happening within the society. So to that extent, Australians are no different to any other peoples. I think historically, however, we've been able to control immigration in a way that just hasn't been possible in most other countries around the world, and for that reason we think about borders very differently. I mean, you go into any European country and you just wander in, really. I've just come from Uganda, and if somebody is coming from an African country, you can't get back into Australia unless you've got your vaccination booklet, show that you've got yellow fever and goodness knows what else. You're put through the third degree if you tick that you've been in an African country. I went from Uganda into Switzerland and then through into London. Nobody cared. Nobody stopped me to take all my clothes out and to spray my shoes and irradiate the wooden artefacts that I'd collected along the way. That only happened when I got back to Australia. So we just think about immigration differently here. I think, again, because we're an island people.
One of the arguments on this issue is the fact that it's a lot easier to control the comings and goings within Australia.
It's true. I think the problem here is that we are one of the most multicultural societies in the world. And if you start this fear game, if you start fomenting fear about the person who looks different, who comes into the country because of what they wear or because of the colour of their skin, you ultimately really damage the fabric of society, because once you get past immigration control, who knows whether you've got a visa or you haven't got a visa. We don't have barcodes on our foreheads. And if you start fomenting this type of fear, then everybody who looks different, wears different clothes, is going to cop it sweet. We learned that to our cost in the mid-naughty years, in 2004, 2005, following the Pacific Solution and all the horrible build-up that came around boat people at that time. We ended up with the Cronulla riots. We ended up with 240 people who were permanent residents and citizens wrongfully arrested and even deported from Australia. Now, what I find damaging is that people don't see the connection between the rhetoric about asylum seekers and what happens inside the society as a result of that rhetoric.
I personally think that what the government is doing with their intentions with Indonesia can't entirely be following international law. But with that being said, could you please take the listeners through just a bit of what the government's plan is to do with asylum seekers?
International law, I think, got thrown out like the baby with the bathwater some time ago. In 2001, the coalition government got away with international blue murder, really, running interdiction, mandatory detention. We ended up with jurisprudence that is worse than any developed country in terms of laws that say that people can be detained for the term of their natural life if they happen to be non-citizens. We had pushback policies and everything. So, international law has been an absolute victim of these policies all the way along. What the new government is doing, the present coalition government, is they're trying to reintroduce all of the policies that John Howard put in place in 2001. The problem that they face is that the key elements of those policies, namely pushbacks to Indonesia, probably won't be capable of being carried through with, for the simple reason that Indonesia in 2001, because of the shock of 9/11, we were able to get agreement with the Indonesian government, both in terms of what they would let us do, but also in terms of what they were prepared to do to work with us to stop the boats, that we are some way off being able to achieve today. Now, it's my hope that with the change of government and with the dropping of the just incessant rhetoric about Australia having open borders and so on and so forth, that we will turn around now and get some more sensible, engaged policy that respects Indonesia and works with Indonesia to try and stop irregular maritime migration.
Mary, what was your opinion throughout the election while watching the coalition government sort of discuss their campaign and policy about asylum seekers?
Look, I think one of the most obscene aspects of the policies at the moment is just how wasteful and abusive the policies are. It's good that we'll stop the rhetoric, but my fear is that nobody is actually going to sit down and look sensibly at this problem as a world phenomenon. Rather, we are stuck in our own Australian introspective focus, and while we do that, we will just waste just so much money and hurt so many people. The figures that I've seen suggest that the government, both sides, are committing to spending upwards of $9 billion. I'm not quite sure over how many years that is, but if you look at the fact that UNHCR, the UN agency responsible for all of the world's refugees, they have a global annual budget of about $3 billion. And so that just puts in perspective how obscene our expenditure is relative to the size of our problem. Even if we do get 20,000 boat people, even if we had 30,000, the Syrian crisis alone, they think, could ultimately generate up to 10 million refugees. There are 2 million refugees currently living in Jordan, and Turkey is also housing just hundreds and hundreds of thousands of these people. Like, you're getting 30,000 people a day sometimes crossing borders. So our experience here is minuscule in world terms. It's not minuscule in terms of the number of people who are dying by getting on boats. So I'm not suggesting for a moment that we should not be trying to stop irregular maritime migration. I think we should be. My complaint is that deterrent measures never have worked, never will work. They cost a fortune, they harm a lot of people, and they damage us financially. They tear at the social structure of our multicultural society, and they are totally ineffective.
As we all know, one of the obvious facts of how government runs is whoever's in the opposition will have the default opposite view of the existing government. Do you think that we could end up with a softer view on asylum seekers from the Labor government in the future?
I think the only way to solve this problem is going to be to take the politics out of it and to make it a bipartisan policy. We have pretty close to a bipartisan policy now. My complaint is that it's a bi-party stupid policy. If you're able to actually get the parties to sit down and look rationally at what they're doing and to say, hey, we can't afford Nauru and Manus Island, that it's a waste of money and a waste of time, we would really be making great strides forward. I can't see that happening in the short term because the present government made so much of the closure by the Labor government of those two places.
Big thank you to Mary Crock for discussing her views on the asylum seeker debate. Now on to our next guest, Jane Adams, who will be discussing the myths associated with asylum seekers. Jane, you're someone who's been very vocal in recent times about the topics of myths surrounding asylum seekers. What are some of the major misconceptions surrounding these people?
Well, first and foremost is the idea that boat people are queue jumpers. These are people who we haven't invited here, and therefore they are taking the places of refugees who've been waiting in camps in an orderly manner to be resettled. That's one of the biggest myths, because it suggests that refugee camps are systematic, orderly places where you come in with your number, like going to the delicatessen at the supermarket and you've got your number, and when your number comes up, you get resettled. It doesn't happen like that at all. People, if they can even flee to a refugee camp, and sometimes there isn't one for them to go to, or the journey is so dangerous that they can't get to it. But once they are there, they have to have their claim assessed, and then each year the UNHCR officers there will be asked basically for a list of people who are awaiting resettlement. That list is then considered by the Immigration Department. And the Immigration Department has certain ethnic composition of people they may like, or what nationality is a priority for resettlement at any particular time. They may wish to resettle particularly vulnerable people, but that requires those people to even be brought to the attention of the resettlement officers. And people have often said the most vulnerable people in refugee camps often don't have spokespeople for them to even bring them to the attention of the resettlement officers. So resettlement is somewhat of a lottery, and there are many millions of people who have been living for at least 5 years or more in a refugee camp with no prospect of resettlement or any other durable solution forthcoming. Another myth, of course, is that asylum seekers are terrorists. Now, fortunately, that's dropped off the political agenda a little bit at the moment, but it was a myth that John Howard used to talk up a lot.